Vikings are often pictured as fierce raiders with dragon-headed ships. Stories focus on their attacks and plunder across Europe. But the untold part is the battles they faced at home. Their resilience was shaped not just by raids, but by struggle and exploration. This hidden chapter truly defines their lasting legacy. When a longship returned, heavy with silver, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of a new, often bloodier one. We might imagine victorious warriors returning to quiet farmsteads, but the reality was way more chaotic. Viking society wasn't a unified empire. It was a tangled web of clans and chieftains, where power was always up for grabs and loyalty had to be earned. A successful raid leader didn't just come back with treasure, he came back with influence. The silver he handed out was used to build alliances, buying the loyalty he needed to challenge local rulers. This flood of new wealth completely destabilized the old order, fueling bitter power struggles and civil wars. A perfect example is the story of the Great Heathen Army. Norse sagas, written centuries later, claim it was led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, seeking revenge for his death. While the link to Ragnar is likely a myth, the army itself was very real. In 865 CE, a massive coalition of Norse warriors landed in England. This wasn't a simple raid, it was a full-blown invasion. They toppled Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, captured the great city of York, and remade it as their own capital, Jorvik. The skills, wealth, and reputation earned from years of raiding were now being reinvested into a war of conquest. It shows how the end of one raid was often just the prelude to a much bigger conflict, turning successful pirates into powerful warlords and aspiring kings. When we think of Vikings, we often picture fierce warriors and raiders, but their daily life was much more than battles and plunder. Most Vikings were farmers, fishermen, and traders. Their homes were simple but cozy, built from wood and turf, with a large hearth at the center where families would gather. Viking women played an important role. They managed households and farms, participated in trade, and sometimes even defended their families and lands in battle. Children learned life skills and combat techniques from an early age, while ancient tales and legends were passed down through storytelling and poetry. Vikings also valued art and symbolism. Carvings on stones, jewelry, and pottery told stories of clans, achievements, and religious beliefs. They were not only warriors and explorers, but also a society with a rich culture, art, and enduring traditions. Over time, the raiders started to figure out that settling down and ruling was a lot more profitable than endless looting. Maybe the most stunning example is the founding of Normandy. For decades, Viking fleets had terrorized the rivers of modern-day France. In 911 CE, the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, made the Viking leader Rollo a radical offer: land in exchange for peace. Rollo and his men were granted a huge territory that would become Normandy, literally the land of the Northmen. They swore loyalty to the king, converted to Christianity, and in a brilliant strategic move, became the guardians of France against other Viking raiders. A few generations later, these former pirates had become French-speaking feudal lords, but they never lost their edge. These Normans, descendants of Viking settlers, would become one of the most formidable forces in Europe, eventually conquering England in 1066. This pattern happened everywhere. In England, the territory held by the descendants of the Great Heathen Army became the Danelaw, a region where Norse laws and customs dominated. And in the east, Norsemen known as the Rus sailed down the great rivers, becoming a ruling class over the local Slavic tribes. They were central to founding a powerful state, Kievan Rus, which laid the foundations for modern Russia and Ukraine. The Viking raider, through relentless conflict, had evolved into a settler, a duke, and a prince. They had learned the ultimate prize wasn't silver you could carry, but land you could hold. While some Vikings were trading their swords for scepters in Europe, others were looking in the opposite direction, not toward rich, settled lands, but into the terrifying, unknown emptiness of the North Atlantic. The same daring that fueled their raids also drove an incredible age of exploration. Their mastery of shipbuilding and navigation gave them the tools to push the known world to its limits. This was a different kind of resilience. Courage to face the stormy void, armed with little more than instinct and an absolute refusal to be afraid. The ultimate expression of this came around the year 1000 CE with the voyage of Leif Erikson. Sailing west from the small Norse colony in Greenland, Leif and his crew became the first Europeans to set foot in North America, a continent they called Vinland. This wasn't a raid. There were no cities to sack. The sagas say it was a journey driven by a need for resources like timber, which was scarce in Greenland, but also by sheer curiosity and tales of wild grapes, which gave Vinland its name. They even met the indigenous peoples, whom they called Skraelings, and tried to build a settlement. For centuries, many thought this was just a myth. But then, in the 1960s, archaeologists in Newfoundland, Canada, uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Lonso Meadows. They found the foundations of turf longhouses, an iron forge, and Viking artifacts. The sagas were true, but this unwritten chapter doesn't have a happy ending. The Vinland settlement failed. Faced with a harsh environment, the overwhelming distance from home, and violent conflicts with the native population, the Vikings abandoned their American dream. And yet, the fact that they made it at all, 500 years before Columbus, is a staggering achievement. It reveals a side of the Vikings we often forget. They weren't just warriors, but pioneers, driven by a curiosity that pushed them to the very edge of the map. So what happened to the Vikings? They weren't wiped out in some great final battle. They didn't just vanish. The truth is, they evolved. The Viking Age ended because the very definition of a Viking, a seaborne raider, became obsolete. The world had changed, and the Norsemen had changed right along with it. Three big forces brought about this transformation. First, the kingdoms of Europe got stronger. At the start of the era, Europe was fragmented and an easy target. By the 11th century, powerful states with professional armies had emerged, making raids a much riskier business. Second, and maybe most important, was Christianity. As Norse chieftains converted, they were drawn into the culture of Christian Europe, which condemned raiding and brought new political structures. Finally, the Vikings stopped being Vikings. They had become Danes, Swedes, Norwegians, and Normans. They had kings and countries. The year 1066 is often seen as the bookend for the Viking Age, at least in England. That year, two battles sealed the deal. At Stamford Bridge, a Norwegian king named Harald Hardrada, often called the Last Great Viking, was killed trying to invade England. Just weeks later, William the Conqueror, a descendant of the Viking Rollo, successfully conquered England at the Battle of Hastings. One invasion, led by a traditional Viking-style king, failed. The other, led by an assimilated Christian Norman duke, succeeded. The age of the raider was over. The age of the Norse king and nobleman had begun. The Vikings didn't decline. They transformed, becoming traders, rulers, and Christian kings. Their true strength lay in adapting, settling, and building, not just fighting. They terrorized Europe, but also founded kingdoms and explored far lands. From Russia to North America, their influence was widespread and lasting. The unwritten chapters of their story proved to be the most important. If you love exploring untold stories from the past, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. Which part of the Viking legacy do you find most fascinating? Let us know in the comments below.